Dan was hired by a mysterious contractor to clean an abandoned building, but he never expected to find a room full of snakes when entering one of the rooms. He did not like snakes at all, but something else was at play here. The snakes were very aggressive. Dan had never seen this before. Then he saw something underneath the snakes. He realized they were protecting something. Dan got a strange feeling about this. This couldn't be good. But before we start, smash the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming stories. Dan tried to come closer to the object, but with every step, the snakes became more aware of Dan. Dan had to be careful, but when trying to reach for the object, he was bitten. He felt intense pain in his arm. He could not do this alone. He went back to his van, which was parked right in front of the house. He applied a bandage first, but he still had a lot of pain in his arm. He thought about leaving this alone, but was offered a lot of money to do the job. Then he got a call, getting called by an anonymous number. He picked up. Dan got told that he needed to hurry up or bad things would happen. Dan looked around. It was like the person was watching him. What was the meaning of this? Dan was completely shocked. This could not end well for him. Dan mustered all of his courage to call the police, but when they answered, he hung up. He could not risk the safety of his family. It was way too risky. He just needed to clean this room and give this contractor whatever he wanted. He decided not to call anyone to help him just because he did not know who hired him in the first place. He had to get good protective gear. However, the bite on his arm also started to hurt a lot. Dan quickly picked up his gear and drove back to the house. The whole time he had a feeling he was being watched, but he did not see anyone. Dan reluctantly walked back into the house. He walked up the massive staircase. He already heard the hissing of the snakes. The strange thing was there were no snakes outside of the room. They were all inside the room. When entering the room again, his jaw dropped. He walked in and gasped. It looked like the room was filled with even more snakes now. They instantly turned to Dan. They were very aware of Dan's presence but did not straight up attack him. Only when Dan got closer they reacted. Dan had previously handled tough jobs, but none compared to the pressure he faced now. Navigating through a snake-infested area in protective gear, he was initially aided by the suit. However, the snakes began to constrict and bite him, causing severe pain and making him feel trapped. Despite his struggle to reach a critical object, he was bitten and felt increasingly ill, ultimately collapsing from a lack of oxygen and venom. When he regained consciousness, he found himself in an unfamiliar, unfriendly environment. Overhearing a conversation about knowing too much, he realized he was in danger. He was forcibly taken in a van, unable to communicate due to his weakness and fear. The men interrogated him about an item he was supposed to retrieve, but Dan, barely conscious, could only shake his head. He woke up again in a creepy room, strapped to a bed, and still confused about his situation. Then someone entered the room. A man that looked like a doctor entered the room. He had stitched up Dan and provided him with the necessary care. The man looked extremely nervous. Dan asked him to let him go, but the doctor remained silent. Then he nodded to a camera. Two men came into the dark room and unstrapped Dan. Dan was dragged into another room. This looked more like an interrogation room. Dan begged the people to let him go, but they wouldn't budge. They started asking him questions. Dan was asked if he knew what they were looking for. Dan had no idea, but he had a feeling that it had something to do with the house and the snakes. They needed something very special or sensitive in that room to get a hold of. Apparently, they wanted someone else to do it without risking anyone. They asked if he had been involved or informed anyone about what he was doing there. Dan assured them he did not tell anyone about his job. Not even his wife. He was scared. The man started to believe him. But then they heard a loud bang. Dan is extremely confused. The man got up and quickly ran away. Dan did not know what to do and remained seated. He heard a lot of shouting and gunfire. This cannot be good. Then he saw something rolling in the room, and he was blinded. Dan heard shouting all around him while he was on the floor. He covered his ears because some of the noises really pierced through. Dan realized what was happening. The CBUA team had broken into the building. They were just in time to break Dan out of this strange situation. Dan had so many questions in his mind. How did they even get here? Were they looking for him? They would all be answered soon. Dan was brought outside, and in the corner of his eye, he saw the two men who had been questioning him earlier. They were both arrested. First, the team told Dan they weren't there for him. It was blind luck that he was rescued. Dan was just lucky enough that the SWAT got enough information to arrest this criminal organization that Dan was being kept at. Then he started telling them about the snakes. The men who rescued Dan were initially skeptical of his story, finding it hard to believe despite the evidence of his snake bites. They followed him to his house, where they were shocked to find his car burned out. Upon entering the house, they heard snakes and decided to wait for a specialized team due to the danger involved. Dan, anxious and eager to avoid another encounter with the snakes, called in a police team. They arrived swiftly, equipped with protective suits, and Dan felt reassured with their presence. He learned that his family was also safe. Dan guided the police to the location of the room. As the team entered and began clearing the snakes, they faced unexpected difficulties, requiring additional backup. The situation escalated with aggressive snakes and chaotic conditions, prompting discussions about burning down the building to contain the threat. With more police forces, Homeland Security, and government agencies arriving, Dan was advised to go home and await an update. The next day, instead of the anticipated anticipated call from the police captain, Dan received a call from the major, who had crucial information for him. Dan was summoned to the major's office, uncertain about whether this would bring good news or further trouble. He still had the object on his mind. He needs to know what it is. It would soon be revealed by the major. When entering the office, Dan was told to sit down. He had brought his wife and kids with him. First, the major assured him that the whole organization was arrested. He would not have to fear them anymore. Then someone else joined the room. The police captain joined the room. He had a medal with him to honor Dan's bravery. The captain had told everything to the major. The major was so intrigued by the story that he had to give Dan this medal. They began telling Dan that they had managed to clear out the room that night. It had taken them 5 hours to clear the entire room. When they realized why the snakes were there and why there were so many, it finally clicked for them. The snakes were protecting their own eggs. These are extremely expensive and fragile. That is why the criminals needed a specialist who had no clue what was going on to retrieve them for them. Dan sighed. He was happy it was all over.